Man saves crying bear from trap, but then something heartbreaking happens. The low, mournful sound drifted through the morning mist like a distant prayer, barely audible above the whisper of wind through pine needles. Forest Ranger. David Martinez paused mid-step along the familiar trail, his weathered hand instinctively reaching for the radio clipped to his vest. In 23 years of patrolling these woods, he had learned to distinguish between the ordinary calls of the wild and something far more troubling. This was neither territorial dispute nor mating call. This was distress, raw and unrelenting. He followed the sound deeper into the forest, his boots silent against the carpet of damp leaves. The crying grew stronger with each careful step, a guttural vocalization that seemed to rise from somewhere primal and desperate. Through a grove of towering firs he caught his first glimpse of movement, a massive form shifting against the forest floor, dark fur matted with moisture and debris. The black bear was enormous, easily 400 pounds, her powerful frame now reduced to helpless thrashing. David's breath caught as he took in the scene. Her left front paw was clamped tight in the jagged teeth of a rusted leg-hold trap, the kind that had been illegal in these parts for over a decade. The metal bit deep into her flesh, and dried blood had crusted around the wound where she had struggled against the unforgiving steel. From his position behind a fallen log, David could see the bear's condition more clearly. Her coat, which should have been thick and lustrous in preparation for winter, hung loose and dull. Her ribs showed faintly beneath the fur, suggesting she had been trapped for days, unable to forage or hunt. The ground around her was torn and scattered with broken branches where she had fought against her captor, wearing herself down to exhaustion. She lifted her massive head as another wave of pain coursed through her, releasing that same haunting cry that had drawn him here. Her dark eyes, usually alert and intelligent, were clouded with fatigue and confusion. There was no aggression in her posture now, only a bone-deep weariness that spoke of a creature pushed beyond her limits. David studied the trap more closely from his safe distance. The mechanism was old but still brutally effective, designed by poachers who cared nothing for the suffering they caused. The bear's repeated attempts to free herself had only tightened the grip of the metal jaws, and her paw was now swollen to nearly twice its normal size. Moving with deliberate slowness, David reached for his radio, keeping his voice barely above a whisper. The bear's ears twitched at the sound, but she lacked the energy to do more than watch him with those tired, pain-filled eyes. He knew that despite her current state, she was still a wild animal, still dangerous, still deserving of the utmost respect and caution. The forest around them held its breath, as if the trees themselves were witnesses to this encounter between two species, one trapped and suffering, the other compelled by conscience to help. David felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders as he assessed the situation. This was no simple rescue. It would require patience, skill, and a deep understanding of the delicate balance between compassion and survival. The bear's soft whimpering continued, a sound that seemed to echo not just through the forest, but through something much deeper, touching the very core of what it meant to be both wild and vulnerable in a world that had grown increasingly small and unforgiving. The rescue equipment arrived within an hour, carried by David and two fellow rangers who moved through the forest with the careful silence of those who understood they were entering sacred territory. The bear had quieted some since dawn, but her dark eyes tracked every movement as the three men positioned themselves at safe distances around her. The tranquilizer gun remained holstered. David had made that choice deliberately, knowing that sedating a stressed animal in unknown health could prove fatal. Instead, he chose the path of patience. Settling onto a fallen log 20 feet away, David began the slow process of becoming part of the bear's world rather than an intruder in it. He spoke in low, steady tones, his voice barely rising above the natural sounds of the forest. The words themselves mattered less than the rhythm, gentle, consistent, unhurried. Hours passed this way, the sun climbing higher through the canopy as David gradually moved closer, each advance measured in mere inches. The bear's breathing had grown less labored, though her injured paw remained grotesquely swollen where the trap's teeth had bitten deep. David could see that infection had begun to set in. the tissue around the wound taking on an angry red hue that spoke of precious time already lost. Yet something in her posture suggested this was not merely about physical pain. Even in her exhausted state, there was a restlessness to her movements, a turning of her head toward deeper parts of the forest that spoke of concerns beyond her own suffering. By mid-afternoon, David had positioned himself close enough to begin working with the trap mechanism. His movements were deliberate and slow, each action telegraphed by soft words of reassurance. "Easy, girl," he whispered as his hands found the release mechanism buried beneath years of rust and forest debris. The bear's muscles tensed at his proximity, but she no longer struggled, as if some ancient understanding had passed between them, predator and prey momentarily set aside in the face of mutual need. The trap's release required both strength and precision. David had to work the spring mechanism while simultaneously prying open the jaws that had held her captive. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool air as he applied steady pressure, feeling the resistance of metal that had been designed to hold with unforgiving efficiency. The bear remained motionless during these crucial moments, her breathing shallow but steady, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the trees. When the trap finally gave way, the sound was barely audible, a soft click that seemed almost anticlimactic after the hours of patient work. The bear's paw came free in a rush, and she immediately pulled it against her chest, her whole body shuddering with what might have been relief. David backed away quickly, giving her the space she needed to process her newfound freedom. But instead of the expected retreat into the forest depths, the bear did something unexpected. After a few tentative steps to test her weight on the injured paw, she turned not toward the safety of dense cover, but toward a specific direction deeper in the woods. Her movements carried a new urgency, a purpose that had nothing to do with escape or self-preservation. She looked back at David once, her expression unreadable but somehow pleading, before beginning to limp with determined effort toward whatever called to her in those shadowed depths. David felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. This was not the behavior of a rescued animal seeking solitude to heal. This was the desperate urgency of a mother, and somewhere in the forest, ahead lay the reason for her frantic need to return to a place she should never have left. David followed at a respectful distance, as the bear moved through the underbrush with painful determination. Her injured paw left occasional traces of blood on fallen leaves, but she pressed forward with an urgency that transcended her physical limitations. The afternoon light filtered through the canopy in golden shafts, illuminating her path as she navigated terrain that spoke of intimate familiarity. This was her territory, her home range, and every step carried the weight of desperate purpose. The den was tucked beneath the massive root system of an ancient oak, hidden so well that David might have walked past it a dozen times without notice. It was exactly the kind of shelter a mother bear would choose: protected, secluded, defensible. As they approached, the bear's movements became more erratic, her pace quickening despite the obvious pain in her wounded limb. She paused at the entrance, her large head turning back toward David with an expression that seemed to carry both warning and plea. What followed was perhaps the most profound silence David had ever experienced. The bear disappeared into the shadowy opening of the den, and for long minutes the forest held its breath. Then came a sound that would haunt him for years, a low, keening vocalization that rose from somewhere deeper than mere animal instinct. It was grief made audible, raw and primal and utterly heartbreaking in its honesty. David remained motionless as the bear emerged, carrying in her mouth the still form of a small cub. The little body was perhaps 8 weeks old, its fur still bearing the downy softness of extreme youth. She placed it gently on a bed of moss near the den entrance, her massive paws moving with impossible tenderness. A second trip brought another cub, equally small, equally still. They had been too young to survive without their mother's constant warmth and nourishment, too dependent to endure the 3 days of her absence. The bear settled beside her cubs, her enormous frame dwarfing their tiny forms as she nuzzled each one in turn. There was no howling, no dramatic display of emotion, just the quiet, methodical behavior of a mother examining what remained of her world. She licked their faces clean with the same careful attention she would have given them in life, her tongue moving in slow, deliberate strokes across fur that would never again respond to her touch. David understood that he was witnessing something sacred, something that demanded nothing from him except respectful witness. He removed his hat and stood in silent acknowledgement of loss that transcended species, of love that remained constant even in the face of ultimate failure. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words barely audible above the whisper of wind through the trees. As evening approached, the bear finally lifted her head from her cubs and looked directly at David. In her dark eyes, he saw not accusation but exhaustion, the bone-deep weariness of a mother who had fought against impossible odds and lost everything that mattered. She rose slowly, turned her back on the den and her cubs, and walked deeper into the forest without looking back. The last rays of sunlight slanted through the trees, casting long shadows across the quiet clearing where two small lives had ended too soon, leaving behind only the echo of love and the weight of what might have been.